So thank you all for coming this morning, and a special welcome again to our guests who have traveled from afar and have made room in their very, very busy schedule, in particular Monica, I think, who's been flying here and there all the time to accommodate a visit to Berkeley. So this event is the first in a series of gatherings organized by the Tang Center, or what, hopefully organized by the Tang Center, on the various oases of the Silk Road. Workshops that we would like to lead to a series of books published by UC Press on several of the larger nodes of these Eurasian trading networks. Think Kuchad and Khotan, Turfan, Sogdiana, Samarkand, and Bukhara. Why do we really want this series? We were trying to think of a publication series, and we were trying to think what really was needed or what was lacking. So when it comes to Silk Road studies, you have pretty much two options. You have the grand narratives, Silk Road narratives, that talk about long-distance exchange, where you think about, how religion moves, trade, ideas kind of spread. For example, Buddhism, along the Silk Road, or paper and silk that moved, from China to other places, that don't spend a lot of time thinking about what's happening on the ground, really, as these things are moving. And on the other hand, you really have a lot of great scholarship that is micro-scale, that kind of zeroes in within a disciplinary framework on some of the pieces that were uncovered in these nodes along the Silk Road. So you can think of Tibetan ritual manuscripts within the larger corpus of the Dunhuang Library Cave findings. Or you can think of the wonderful work that the team of Monica is doing in kind of unraveling the paintings, right, of Kizil, or the paintings in the larger Kucha area, perhaps primarily focusing on the Buddhist context of those paintings. What we don't have is really the in-between, trying to understand what these oases were, how they functioned, what their history, long-term history, was. How is Buddhism in the environment of, say, Kucha, very specific and localized in a particular history, socio-political, economic. So, Satomi and I were talking yesterday about when we try to assign books for teaching, for example, to even our graduate students, trying to sort of give them an understanding of these places. It's hard to do because you're just picking pieces, right? So this is the idea behind the series of workshops that we're hoping to organize, of which this one is the first. So we're hoping, away from sort of the public eye this weekend, to also kind of think about the anatomy of such a volume on Kucha. How could you present something comprehensive that includes perhaps the most fascinating parts of the Kucha oasis, beyond this kind of micro-scale, research. So that was just to kind of introduce our thinking and our idea about perhaps what is needed for getting a better understanding of the Silk Road and what was happening on the ground, in these places. So Monica's talk yesterday was really fascinating because that Tocharian element in Kucha is really fascinating, and how we want to sort of talk about how we can weave that together and localize what we know about Kucha, and sort of present this very specific framework that is different than Khotan, that is different than Turfan, or even Dunhuang. So that's the answer to why we're doing what we're doing and our objectives for the next couple of years. So back to Kucha, for this purpose, we brought together a number of the great scholars on Kucha, the specialists, who are going to present their work. We thought this workshop has two elements. One, we asked people to come and present their recent research, and then on the side, we're going to have this discussion about this possible volume and see if we can put that together. So what I'm going to do is briefly introduce all the presenters this morning, so we can then seamlessly go through each presentation. After the second presentation, we'll have a break and then for some coffee, and then we'll come back and finish up. So I apologize that these are very brief introductions, but more extensive CVs, of course, can be found online. Too much to cover all the excellent scholarship in my introductory remarks. So Ines Konchak-Nagel received her doctorate in 2011 from LMU's Buddhist Studies program on Pranidhi depictions of the Northern Silk Road, the motif of the prophecy of Sakyamuni's Buddhahood in the paintings of Xinjiang. After several postdoctoral fellowships, she served as a faculty member at the Institute of Indology and Central Asian Studies, University of Leipzig. She was a freelance research assistant at the Museum für Asiatische Kunst, Staatliche Museen zu Berlin, as a member of the project Medieval Pre-Islamic Architecture in Kocho, financed by the Gerda Henkel Foundation and directed by the curator of Central Asian art, Dr. Lila Russell-Smith. Since 2016, she has been a research associate in the long-term project, Buddhist Murals of Kucha on the Northern Silk Road at the Saxon Academy of Sciences and Humanities in Leipzig, and she's a member of Monika Zinn's team there. Among her most recent publications are representations of architecture and architectural elements in the wall paintings of Kucha. That was published in 2020 as one of the first of the Leipzig Kucha studies, essays and studies in the art of Kucha. Another publication is The Ruins of Kocho, Traces of Wooden Architecture on the Ancient Silk Road, edited by herself and Lila Russell-Smith, that came out in 2016. She's currently working on a book on depictions of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas in the wall paintings of Kucha belonging to the first and second Indo-Iranian styles. Our second speaker, Satomi Hiyama. With Monika Zinn serving as a doctoral advisor, Satomi Hiyama received a PhD in art history at the Free University of Berlin in 2014 on the mural paintings of the Buddhist rock monasteries in Kucha, after which she became a research fellow at the Asian Art Museum of Berlin from 2010 to 2016. She was a postdoctoral fellow at Ryukoku University from 2016 to 2018, and an assistant professor at Kyoto University from 2018 to 2023. She just recently was appointed a research fellow at the International College for Postgraduate Buddhist Studies in Tokyo. She is a specialist on early Buddhist rock monasteries in what is now Western China, and has an interest in cosmological and astral representations in Central and East Asian Buddhist visual arts. Among her publications, she has a monograph co-authored with Professor Giuseppe Vignato, Traces of the Sarvastivadins in the Buddhist Monasteries of Kucha, which was published as Leipzig Kucha Studies 3 in 2022. Another article was published in the Indo-Asiatische Zeitschrift in 2020, New Identification of the Mural Fragments from the Pfauenhöhle, Peacock Cave in Kizil Cave number 76. Since we're going to have a break, maybe I'll introduce the speakers of the second half of this morning's panel after the break. Wang Fang and also Diego. Oh, you are here. I thought you weren't going to be here, so I was going to wait. But it's okay. Let's wait anyway. I'll introduce the final two speakers after the break. So let me ask Dr. Konchak Nagel to speak to us. And please help me welcome.
Yeah, thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this workshop. It is a pleasure to be here. Today I want to speak on a little researched subject, and that is depictions of the Bodhisattva in Tushita Heaven and paintings of the first Indo-Iranian style. So from Kucha, and especially from the cave complex of Kizil, there is a considerable number of depictions of the Bodhisattva in Tushita Heaven. And most of these depictions are known from caves with paintings executed in the second style, and such depictions are located in the lunette of the front wall of the main chamber, and but we have also depictions of the first Indo-Iranian style, which I will introduce to you, and we have also one depiction of the Bodhisattva in Tushita Heaven in Uyghur style, but only this one. So most of the depictions we know are from paintings of the second style, and these paintings, as I already told you, are located above the entrance, and they are usually interpreted as the Bodhisattva Maitreya in the Tushita Heaven, and it is believed that they are located at this position because they shall give the devotee the hope for the future that Bodhisattva Maitreya will come from the Tushita Heaven and on earth and will act as Buddha there. So when this hope will they get when they leave the cave. Okay. And this is what these depictions look like. A bodhisattva is depicted in the center. The bodhisattva is endowed with a nimbus around the head and a nimbus around the body. He's depicted larger than all the other surrounding deities, and in this case the bodhisattva can be identified because he has the attribute in his left hand, the flask, and oh, sorry, that was. Yeah, what I wanted to show you, this special feature of the nimbus around the head and the nimbus around the body is actually a feature that we have from Buddha depictions, and that the bodhisattva is depicted in such a way means that he is very close to his Buddhahood, and these are the usual depictions of Buddhas. You see they have both the nimbus around the head and the nimbus around the body. So this bodhisattva sits on his throne and with his ankles crossed, and as I told you, in his left hand he is holding the flask, and such or similar depictions we know from Gandharan art, from later Gandharan art, so 3rd to 4th century, and shown is Maitreya in the Tushita Heaven, and that we have Maitreya here do we know because of the flask, and because Maitreya is from the very early depictions, he is shown with the flask in his hand, so that's his typical attribute, and even in the very early inscribed images of Maitreya, we have this typical attribute flask. So we know that, for instance, here in a row with the Buddhas, the Bodhisattva on the left side is Bodhisattva Maitreya, the future Buddha. So, yeah, that's what's also important is that in the upper position of the caves, we have always celestial scenes depicted. And this not only in caves of the second style, as we see here, but also in caves of, with paintings of the first Indo-Iranian style. We have in this upper portion in the lunette heavenly or celestial scenes, and this is, for instance, the King Indra, the king of gods. He's recognizable on his typical crown and the third eye on his forehead. And he's depicted there in his heaven, the Triastringsha heaven. So, and in caves with paintings of the first Indo-Iranian style, we have also in this upper position depictions of deities in celestial scenes and of a bodhisattva who's endowed with a nimbus around the head and a nimbus around the body. The painting that you just saw is from the Frauenhöhle from the cave 76 in Kizil. This cave was discovered by the third German expedition in 1907. And on the left side, you see the cave when it was found. So, a hub of debris was in front of the cave, and on the right side, you see the excavated cave. And this is what the cave looked like when the cave was excavated. So we have an antechamber and a main chamber, and the antechamber was equipped with some wooden elements like small tables and also a step that was leading into the main chamber. And on the left wall, we had in the next to the entrance to the main chamber, we had a depiction of a guardian deity. It's not good preserved, but maybe you can see the feet of this overlarge or larger than life-size figure of a guardian. And as it was recorded by Albert Grünwedel, on the left side wall we had a depiction of the Mara Vijaya. So, and on the right side, we had also a guardian deity depicted. As Grünwedel recorded, this guardian was holding a club, and on the right side wall, we had a depiction of the first sermon of the Buddha. You can still see maybe the body of the gazelle in the lower part of the painting, and also this diamond-shaped object, which is the local adaptation, probably, of the endless knot of the Srivatsa. And if you compare this, what we have from the Frauenhöhle with a depiction in Kizil Cave 69, you can see that on this diamond-shaped construction, the wheel of law was positioned, and this was crowned by a omega-shaped object, Nanyavata, it is called usually. And this is a typical depiction of the first sermon of the Buddha. And in the main chamber, we had a pedestal on which, most probably, a Buddha figure was seated, and above this pedestal, there was a dome, and in the dome there were a depiction of peacock feathers. That's why the cave got the name Frauenhöhle, so peacock cave. And this dome was divided, or this painting in the dome was divided into 16 parts, and each was the background of a naked boy who was flying down with a diadem in his hand and venerating the central Buddha figure. Then in the flat part of the ceiling in the squinches, Grünwedel reported that were Bodhisattva figures in the four squinches of the cave. And And then in between the squinches in the middle, there were deities with raising hands who supported the dome. So all the extant paintings were removed by the third German expedition and were brought to Berlin. And in Berlin, they were exhibited in the former Ethnological Museum, and unfortunately, the museum was destroyed during the Second World War, and also the reconstruction of the cave. So all the paintings from, not all, but mostly all of the paintings from the cave 76, we know only from publications today. Yeah, that is, maybe I show you once again. So this was a reconstruction of the cave in the former museum. And based on this photograph, I found on the internet a reconstruction in Wikimedia made by Pataliputra. And yeah, it looks quite good, but unfortunately it's not reliable. Already Ernst Waldschmidt, the former director of the museum, wrote that this is not an original or not a reconstruction of the original cave. So the reconstruction was made based on didactic and aesthetic considerations. So they omitted the front wall in the cave, and the reconstruction was 1 meter lower than the original cave because the lower portion of the cave was destroyed. And then the best preserved paintings from the left side wall were exchanged with the rear wall, so that the visitor could, when the visitor entered the cave, he could see the best preserved painting. And also these bodhisattva figures that we have here. So Waldschmidt wrote that the bodhisattva figure that we have here in the left rear corner was originally in the right rear corner, and the other bodhisattva figure that we have here is a replica. So it's not a bodhisattva figure that we found there, because they only put this replica there to give an overall aspect of the cave, because based on the records of Albert Grünwede, that there was a bodhisattva in every of the 4 squinches. Yeah, so what we have here is a drawing by Grünwede, and this is what he really found there. So he only found 1 bodhisattva figure in the cave, and this bodhisattva, here it looks as if the bodhisattva figure was in the rear right corner. However, if you do it in perspective, you can see that this is not the rear right corner, but it's the front right corner. So it was, you entered the cave and it was just to your right, the depiction. So this would the more reliable reconstruction of the cave. What's also interesting is that the paintings on the left side were depictions of the life of the Buddha. So we have here, it started with the birth of the Buddha and his first 7 steps, then the encounter with sick man, old man, and a dead person, and then also the seduction of the daughters of Mara. Yeah, the daughters tried to seduce the Buddha. He was not a Buddha then. They tried to how to say, they didn't want that he becomes a Buddha, so they tried to seduce him, and after it was not successful, they turned into old women. So we see on the right side very nice, beautiful women, and on the right side we see old women. And there was the Mara Vijaya, so the attack of Mara by the Buddha. Then Grünwedel recorded of other scenes that were depicted there. And, in the lower register, for instance, we see the parinirvana of the Buddha, the mourning people, and the closing of the coffin of the Buddha. And maybe on the very last picture was a picture of the first council. But we have not only scenes from the life of the Buddha there, we have also, as Satomi could show in her article, we have also depictions of a simile there, and that is a simile that the Buddha Shakyamuni explained to his monks. It is the simile of the 4 poisonous snakes and the 5 sword bearers or foes. The 4 snakes represent the 4 elements, and the 5 foes represent the 5 skandhas, which are the reason why we are attached to this world. So what is also very important is that in the upper friezes of all the side walls was a Buddha figure in the center. And Grünwedel explained these figures on the basis of his knowledge of Mongolian Buddhism. And according to him, we have depicted the Buddha, the past, or the Buddhas of the past, Kanaka Muni in the east, Kashyapa in the north, then Shakyamuni, the present, the Buddha of the present in the south, and Buddha Maitreya, the Buddha of the future, in the west. That is a very interesting idea. However, this cannot be proven because all the Buddha figures look very same. So they have no different appearance. They have all the they show the same gesture and everything. And what is more important, that would be the only instance in Kucha that we have that the future Buddha Maitreya is shown as a Buddha. So normally we don't have that in Kucha. That would be the only instance if Grünwedel would be correct. So, and that Grünwedel assumed that we have had 4 bodhisattvas in the squinches is plausible because of the 4 Buddhas. So it could be that these 4 bodhisattvas were in connection with the 4 Buddhas. And I would suggest that the 4 Buddhas that we have depicted there are all Shakyamuni, because the whole cave is dedicated to Buddha Shakyamuni. We have only paintings of Buddha Shakyamuni there. And that would mean that the bodhisattva we have depicted there is also Buddha Shakyamuni, in Tushita, so before he descended to earth. So that is a depiction of Maitreya from Gandhara once again, it is the same seating position, but however, the flask is missing in this depiction of the Bodhisattva that we have had in the squinch of the Peacock Cave. So this Bodhisattva is seated on the throne with ankle crossed in front of a full-blown lotus, and he's as I already told you, equipped with a nimbus around the head and a nimbus around the body. We also have two deities to his left and to his right, and these are the deities Brahma and Indra. Brahma is recognizable on his Brahmin top knot, and Indra on his typical crown and his third eye on his forehead. And yeah, as I told you, this could be Bodhisattva Shakyamuni. He is depicted there because the flask is missing. What we see here is that he's performing a teaching gesture with his hands. So with his right hand, he encompasses his left fingers, and his right index finger is pointing up. So a very comprehensive study of the Bodhisattva in Tushita heaven, in literature and art, was done by Christian Luzernitz in 2010. And he pointed out that there are only very few texts that refer to the Tushita as the dwelling place of the Bodhisattva prior his Buddhahood. We have texts that only mention the Tushita heaven, like the Ashwagosha's Saundarananda, which is around 100 CE, and the Nidana Katha, which is around 5th century or 500 CE. And they only mention that the Bodhisattva Shakyamuni was reborn in the Tushita heaven after his life as Prince Vessantara. Then a little more information we have in the Mahavastu, which is a part of the Vinaya Pitaka of the Mahasangha Lokuttaravadins, and stated it was developed between the 1st century BCE, CE to the 5th century, 6th century. And this text relates that after being prophesied Buddhahood by his immediate predecessor, Buddha Kashyapa, Shakyamuni was reborn as a deity named Shvetakeshu in the Tushita heaven, and he was surpassing all other gods. Then even more information is given in the Sanghabheda Vastu, which is a section of the Mulasavastivada Vinaya, and is developed around the 2nd to the 5th, 4th, 5th century. And this section describes how the Bodhisattva notifies the gods in Tushita heaven of his descent to earth and invites them to accompany him. When the gods ask him to remain in heaven to teach them, the Bodhisattva explains that deathlessness, which is nirvana, can only be attained on earth. So, and then a very comprehensive description of the Tushita heaven is given in the Lalitavistara, which is probably an original Sarvastivada text, but had undergone several revisions and extensions, so that the full Sanskrit text that we have is the Mahayana Sutra, which was finalized in the late 7th or early 8th century. And the Tibetan version we have of this text is only slightly younger than the Sanskrit text. We have also two Chinese versions, however, they do not mention the episode in the Tushita heaven as elaborate as it is mentioned in the Sanskrit or Tibetan version. So what the Sanskrit and Tibetan version give us an information is that Shakyamuni resided in the Tushita heaven before his final rebirth as a deity named Shvetakeshu. So Ketu is the same name as in the Mahavastu. And he dwelt in a palace of Uchadvacha and taught the other deities the Dharma. The discourse of the Dharma took place amidst a symphony of 84,000 musical instruments and hundreds of thousands goddesses sang, danced, and played instruments and venerated the bodhisattvas. Venerated the bodhisattva were the deities Indra and Brahma, so various Indras and various Brahmas. And when the bodhisattva announced his descent to earth, the gods implored him to stay in Tushita heaven, whereupon Shvetakeshu bestowed his crown on the bodhisattva Maitreya and proclaimed that Maitreya would teach the gods in Tushita the Dharma. So if we have this Lalitavistara text and compare it with our depiction, then we can identify, or we can explain the presence of the gods Indra and Brahma, because both are representatives of the hundreds Indras and Brahmas in the Tushita heaven. And what is also very interesting in this painting is this deity, which is seated to the left of the bodhisattva, and this deity has a flask in his hand. So one could say, okay, a flask is an attribute of a divine being. However, this is the only being that we have in the whole depiction of the celestial setting in the ceiling that is holding a flask. So this could be interpreted as the future Buddha Maitreya. As we know from the Sanskrit text, the Lalitavistara text, the Bodhisattva Maitreya was there when Buddha Shakyamuni as Bodhisattva Shvetaketu gave his teachings in the Tushita heaven, and he was also the one that was in the Tushita heaven proclaimed as the successor of Bodhisattva Shvetaketu, who is Buddha Shakyamuni. So that is only a depiction of all the other deities. So this deity to the left of the Bodhisattva is the only one with the flask in his hand. So what's also important is in the Lalitavistara is mentioned that the Bodhisattva developed the 32 lakshanas, the marks of a great being, so the physical marks of a great being, and these marks indicate his boundless accumulation of merit and wisdom, and this we have also depicted here. We have shown two of these lakshana, which is the Una on the forehead, so this little hair, and as you see, the webbing between the fingers. Depictions of Buddha Shakyamuni in Tushita heaven are known from South India, so from the Andhra region. This is an example from Amaravati. We see here the Bodhisattva in Tushita heaven, surrounded by other deities. Then this is the descent, so the Bodhisattva in form of an elephant is coming down from the Tushita heaven to the earth. Here the elephant is carried by heavenly beings in a palanquin, and the third scene is the conception or the dream of the Queen Maya when the elephant enters her right side. And also from Nagarjunakonda we have such depictions. We see here in the upper scene the Bodhisattva Shakyamuni in Tushita heaven, and in the lower scene the elephant in the palanquin carried by deities, and which is a symbolization of the descent of the Bodhisattva to the earth. And what is also important is that the Bodhisattva Shakyamuni here in this depiction has also the webbings, so some of the 32 lakshanas. What I also wanted to show you is the teaching gesture. This teaching gesture is very interesting because it is very rare in Kucha. We have it only here in this representation of the Bodhisattva. And yeah, the Bodhisattva is performing the teaching gesture because he's teaching the gods in the Tushita heaven. And sorry, it was the wrong way. And as Monika Singh could show, this teaching gesture originates from the South Indian art, so from the art of Andhra. Here we have a very early example in Kanaganahalli from the 1st century CE, where the Vidura Pandita teaches the Nagas in the very same gesture. So he encompassed with his right hand his left fingers and his right index fingers pointing up. And we have this teaching gesture also in Gandhara, but here it is very, very rare. I know it only from depictions that are coming from Chotorak. And usually this is interpreted as Bodhisattva Maitreya, because of the crossed ankles. But that is, as I told you, very rare, this teaching gesture. The normal teaching gesture in Gandhara, we see to the right side, so it's only that with his left hand he's touching the closed fingers of the right hand. That is the usual teaching gesture that we have in Gandhara. Yeah, it is very unfortunate that we don't have the other depictions of the bodhisattvas who were depicted in the squinches. It could be that they were different, so maybe we had a bodhisattva Maitreya also depicted there with a flask in his hand. However, we cannot tell whether they were different, and if they were different, maybe they belonged to different Buddhas. If Grünwald is right with his assignment of the Buddhas to the different cardinal directions, this bodhisattva would also correspond to the Buddha Shakyamuni, because it was directly above the Buddha Shakyamuni on the entrance wall. Yeah, then we have another depictions of bodhisattvas in the first Indo-Iranian style, and this is in the cave next to the cave 76 and the cave 77. This was a cave of different architecture, so we have here a monumental image cave. Again, I took a reconstruction, a digital reconstruction from the internet made by Pataliputra, whoever this person is. Also, this is not very reliable, but it's good to give an idea of the cave. So the position of the paintings is not reliable, which is given here. And what is interesting is that bodhisattvas were depicted in the ceiling of the corridors. So in the ceiling of the left corridor, actually we have only deities, and there's no central, and that's very interesting, there's no central figure. So we have only a number of 9 deities depicted there, and the playing music or dancing, and however, it is clear that this is a celestial scene, not only because the deities are equipped with a nimbus, but also because of the position in the painting where the celestial scenes are depicted. And it was on the outer wall, and on the inner wall, unfortunately, the upper frieze is not preserved, but it was most likely very similar to the one on the opposite wall. But interesting is the right corridor. There we have a depiction of a bodhisattva in the same gesture that we have had in Kyzyl 76. So it's a bodhisattva in the teaching gesture with Indra and Brahma to his left and to his right, who represent the 1,000 Indras and Brahmas who venerate the Bodhisattva in Tushita heaven. And we have also musicians, heavenly musicians there, who could represent the 84,000 musical instruments that were played when the Bodhisattva teaches his Dharma. And what's very interesting, on the opposite wall, so on the inner wall of the right corridor, we have depicted the Bodhisattva Maitreya as we know him. So Maitreya is holding in his left hand a small flask, and as he's also shown in the Tushita heaven, he's also flanked by Indra and Brahma and by heavenly musicians. So what we have here are a depiction of two different bodhisattvas. So one is Shakyamuni with the teaching gesture, and one is Buddha Maitreya, or the future Buddha Maitreya, Bodhisattva Maitreya, as we know him with a flask in his hand. So, and if we have this in mind, maybe we can also interpret other paintings of the second Indo-Iranian style. This is a depiction of a bodhisattva in Tushita heaven in the so-called Treppenhöhle, Kyzyl Cave 110, about which Fang Wang will give us her presentation later. And it was already suggested by Angela Howard that this is not Bodhisattva Maitreya, but instead Buddha or Bodhisattva Shakyamuni, because in this position we have sometimes we have also depictions of the Buddha who's giving, for instance, his first sermon there. So that was her suggestion when Buddha Shakyamuni is shown in this place. Maybe also the Bodhisattva is related to Shakyamuni. What is very interesting is that the whole cave 110 is dedicated to Buddha Shakyamuni. So we have 60 pictures on all the side walls which depict the scenes from the life of Buddha Shakyamuni. And what is missing is the first scene of Buddha Shakyamuni in the Tushita heaven. So the life of the Buddha starts with the birth of the Buddha. So it is very plausible that this Buddha Shakyamuni this depiction of the Bodhisattva in the lunette is the very first picture of the life of the Buddha, which shows Buddha Shakyamuni in Tushita heaven before his descent. Yeah, what is also interesting is, maybe it's not good to see here, but he is not performing the teaching gesture in this case, the Bodhisattva, but he's performing a rhetoric gesture. And we also see that the deities are talking among each other. And this could be that here is depicted not the teaching of the deities, but the informing of the deities that he will descend to earth. And this, if we assume that this is Buddha Shakyamuni shown in Tushita heaven in this position in some instances, we could also explain the whole composition of the front wall of cave 38 in Kyzyl. We have also here the Bodhisattva in this rhetoric gesture surrounded by deities. Here it's a drawing by Grünwedel, which is, maybe you can see it a little bit better here. And beneath the lunette, in the right and left corner, we have a depiction of a pensive bodhisattva, a so-called pensive bodhisattva. Lee, who did a study on the pensive bodhisattva, interpreted the Bodhisattva Nidunet as Maitreya, and she thought, I think she's, that the figures in the left and right are subsidiary listeners to the Bodhisattva Maitreya, or to his teachings in the Tushita heaven. However, we know it from a research by Fang Wang that this depiction of the pensive Bodhisattva is a very important depiction, because it shows not a listener or any pensive Bodhisattva. It shows Prince Siddhartha while his first meditation. And maybe it's not good visible here, but for instance, in the right picture we see a peacock in front of the pensive Bodhisattva. And if we compare this to depiction of the same subject from Kyssel Cave 123, we see that the peacock is holding in its beak a snake, and the snake is holding in the mouth a frog. And what we know from the research of Fang Wang, this is the representation of Siddhartha's first meditation according to the Chinese text 184, in which it is described how Prince Siddhartha watched ploughing a field, and during the ploughing an worm was exposed. This worm was eaten by a frog. The frog was eaten by a snake. The snake in turn was eaten by a peacock. The peacock then was killed by a hawk, and the hawk was then killed by a eagle. So it was a chain of suffering of living beings that the Prince Siddhartha was contemplating on. And this was his very famous first meditation, which is depicted here. So if we now combine all these elements, we can make sense of this composition on the front wall in Cave 38. So depicted are there two very, very crucial moments in the life of the Buddha. The first crucial moment is his decision to descend to earth to become a Buddha. And the first crucial moment is his first meditation, which leads him to become a Buddha and to go to the path to salvation or nirvana. And what might be is that because of the sitting position here of the Bodhisattva, which reminds to Buddha or the Bodhisattva Maitreya, it could be that the artist did it on purpose so that the devotee had the possibility to see either Shakyamuni or Maitreya in this picture. Because Maitreya was famous in the region, and we have text from the region on the meeting with Buddha Maitreya either in the Tushita heaven or on earth when he has become a Buddha. So that was a very important aspect in the life of some Buddhists there. So however, if we have two very distinct bodhisattvas, we can differentiate them, and we can say that these are the very important bodhisattvas in the Shravakayana, which are Bodhisattva Shakyamuni and Bodhisattva Maitreya. So thank you very much.
Everyone. So thank you so much, dear Sanjiot, for organizing this wonderful conference with great people. So it is truly my great honor to present my research in front of such a distinguished audience. So hearing your wonderful plan to publish a book on Kucha, which is accessible to a wider range of readers, I was thinking how I can contribute this volume at the best, and thought that I may present the updated research on my core research question: what kind of cultural identities are lying behind the production of two regional painting styles of the Kucha Kingdom? So The first type is, as already mentioned in Ines Konchak's wonderful talk, the first type is generally known as the first Indo-Iranian style, which is characterized by the warm-colored pigments and the naturalistic depiction of figure. So you see the painter's great effort to represent the three-dimensional depths of the human body by the naturalistic shadowing. Another type is called the second Indo-Iranian style, for which cold-colored pigments such as lapis lazuli are used more frequently, and gold leaves, which were hardly used in the first Indo-Iranian style. The representation of figures shows more manneristic features. So it was Albert Grünwedel, the leader of German Turfan expedition, who first proposed this stylistic classification of the Kucha paintings, namely the painting with the style 1, which corresponds to our first Indo-Iranian style, and which is, according to Grünwedel, closely associated to Gandharan sculpture, became the basis for the later stylistic development of the style 2, or the second Indo-Iranian style. So Grünwedel's view was supported by Ernst Waldschmidt and further enhanced by his reference of the paleographic features of the Brahmi script inscribed in the paintings. So he dated the first Indo-Iranian style to around 500 CE, while the second Indo-Iranian style to around 600 to 650. While this German view became a kind of standard and is still followed in many art historical writings on Kucha, there also exists a counter-argument to this chronological view from a stylistic point of view by Max Klimburg, for example, in which the chronological order of the first and the second Indo-Iranian style is often reversed. Another counter-argument was raised from the carbon-14 dating approach by Chinese scholars since early 1980s, which tends to date the Kucha paintings extremely early with the 3rd century as its outset. Nevertheless, there is a huge difficulty in providing crucial evidence for the chronology of Kucha paintings based solely on the stylistic analysis, which cannot really be objective without combining it with other types of evidences. Furthermore, recent research by Nakagawa and her team demonstrated the technical difficulty to date the Kuchan painting through the carbon-14 dating method from many complicated reasons from the natural scientific point of view. So, my hypothesis is that, my hypothesis to this century-long discussion on Kucha paintings is that these two types of Indo-Iranian style paintings bear witness to the drastic shift of Kuchan Sarvastivada Buddhism that occurred from the middle to the late 6th century. So I reached to this hypothesis by analyzing critical differences of these two painting styles from historical, archaeological, and Buddhological approaches. So before going into my core argument today, I would like to mention that I can fully support the German chronology based on the analysis of some motifs which are exclusively depicted in each style of paintings. These motifs can be related with particular historical condition of the region and thus can be taken as a periodical indicators. For example, some of the first Indo-Iranian style paintings contain the motif of a winged crown. This motif was widely circulated in Central and East Asia during the Afterlight period in the early 6th century, which is thought to be related to the circulation of Penrose coin used as a Sasanian tribute to the Afterlights with the design of the winged crown. Not only the winged crown, but also the motif of the wings itself was also preferred in the art object associated to the hectorite production. The decorative motif of the wing is also available in the first Indo-Iranian style. These motifs can be considered as a footstep of the hectorite who occupied Kucha in the early 6th century. Interestingly, these motifs related to the hectorites are absent in the second Indo-Iranian style paintings. On the other hand, the second Indo-Iranian style paintings include many new motifs, including a Turkic figure who appears in the cremation scene of Kizil Cave 224 in the second Indo-Iranian style. So, as you see, a man wearing a kaftan and has a long ponytail is cutting his own face by a short knife. So both his appearance and this peculiar custom can be associated to the Turkic people in this cultural context. So here I would like just to briefly mention that the insertion of the actual or historical figures into the scenes related to the Mahaparinirvana is often attested in the Buddhist art of the Tang period of China as well. So we can assume that this Turkic figure might be related to the period when Kucha was under the control of the West Turkic Khaganate in the late 6th century to the early 7th century, and his presence in the wall painting can be taken as a reflection of the strong political influence of the Turks in this region in this particular period. In this context, it is also exciting to observe the change of the iconography of merchants from the first to the second Indo-Iranian style paintings. While the merchant in the narrative scenes of the first style paintings are represented as Indian noblemen, those in second style paintings are depicted in the disguise of Sogdian merchant. Sogdian traders dominated the Silk Road trade, especially under the protection of the Western Turkic Khaganate. So not only the representation of a lamenting Turkic figure, but also of Sogdian merchant in the second Indo-Iranian style can be regarded as a reflection of the political situation of the period when Kucha was integrated into the Western Turkic Khaganate. So these are historical observations, in which I bring first Indo-Iranian style into the context of the hectorite occupation of Kucha, and the second style to the West Turkic Khaganate becomes even more interesting by considering their archaeological and Buddhological context. So since 2012, I started an interdisciplinary collaboration with Professor Giuseppe Vignato, an archaeologist of Peking University, as we shared the same research interest and question. So Giuseppe was claiming since his PhD dissertation that the two main groups of the Kucha caves, each decorated with the first and the second Indo-Iranian style paintings, are clearly differed to each other in terms of their architectural concepts and the spatial arrangement, and thus they might have been used by different monastic groups. And I was also thinking the possibility that the two types of the Indo-Iranian style painting seems to be differentiated not only by their stylistic features, but also in terms of the repertoire of the narrative subject, as well as the textual sources related to the paintings. So these two painting styles are possibly linked with two different monastic groups in Kucha that had different identity, cultural tradition, and historical background. 10 years of our tough collaborative research, I would say tough, because it was very intensive collaboration. Anyway, it has resulted in the monograph Traces of the Salvasti Wedding in the Buddhist Monastery of Kucha, which was published as Leipzig Kucha Studies 3 at the beginning of January 2022. Actually 1 week before my son was born. It was a very productive time for me. And our book has many challenges on the traditional approaches on the Kucha caves, and maybe some arguments are provocative enough, so that our view has to be carefully examined and reviewed in course of the advance of the research on this field. Fortunately, though, just last month, a positive book review by Professor Nobuyoshi Yamabe was published on Befeo with many constructive suggestions. And I also received, meanwhile, positive feedbacks and encouragement from several Butoji scholars, including Professor Gregory Chopin. I'm very grateful. So to come to my point, let me briefly introduce the overview of our chronological system of the Kucha caves. So this table shows the 4 phases of the development of Kucha caves, except the caves produced in the Tang period, which clearly has a Mahayanistic content, and this is clearly like import from the Tang China. So these caves with regional features can be regarded as a material remains of Kuchian Salubasti Bardens. So among these 4 phases, what we called tradition A and B in our book correspond to the 2 main cave groups, each associated with 2 Indo-Iranian style paintings. So as we believe that these cave groups embody certain Buddhist traditions which played a major role in the development of art and architecture in Kucha, we concentrated on studying tradition A and B, particularly the less preserved and thus less studied tradition A caves. So tradition A is characterized by the combination of the square caves with various types of ceiling, decorated with statuary and the first Indo-Iranian style paintings, with residential cells with a simple structure. In fact, same type of structures can be found in the structural monasteries such as Subashi and Dudulakol. So this Buddhist tradition seems not to have been limited phenomena in the cave site, but also developed in the structural monasteries or surface temples. Tradition B caves are observed in the old sites throughout Kucha. So this cave group typically contained 1 or more center pillar caves decorated with statuary and the second Indo-Iranian style paintings, combined with the residential cells that were equipped with the stone bed and deposit space, which I mark here green. So this kind of deposit space was not available in the tradition A cave group. Tradition A was first a major type of the monastery in Kucha, which was gradually replaced by the new and more powerful trend, tradition B. So many sites were newly carved in this phase, so tradition B was more widespread than tradition A. In many cases, tradition A cave groups were reformed and modified into tradition B cave groups, but we never see the reversed case. So the chronological order from tradition A to B was an irreversible process, so that cannot be other way around. In fact, in our book, we intentionally avoid discussing the absolute dating of the caves. We instead focused on our relative chronology of the caves. So this chronological frame is my personal suggestion. So based on my study on the historical motifs included in the wall paintings of each style, the shift from tradition A to B most likely occurred in the period when the ruler of Central Asia had been shifted from the Afterlight to the West Turkic Khaganate. Here. And during our research, many fundamental differences between tradition A and B cave groups came up, including the concept of the worship space and the main devotional statue, design of the residential space and of meditation space, layout of decor, preferred narrative topics, and textual sources of the narrative paintings. So today I won't be able to present all of them in detail, so I focus on the features related to the narrative paintings. First, let's compare the layout of the core and narrative content. An interesting fact is that tradition A caves have all different layouts and narrative contents. So even though there are two types of basic format for the layout, exact same decor with the same narrative topics cannot be found in any caves. It looks as if a centralized authority carefully selected the narrative subject to be illustrated in each cave and paid attention not to create a repetition. In contrast, tradition B center pillar caves had basically standardized layout and iconographical program. So it looks as if there was a basic model of the center pillar cave, and the wealthy patrons afford a little larger center pillar cave with abundant use of valuable pigments, while those who afford less could donate for smaller center pillar caves. It's just my assumption. The situation of tradition A caves reminds us of the record of the Agama scholar Fortu Sharmi, who supervised all major monasteries and nunneries of Kuja in the late 4th century, according to the Chu Sanzan Jiji. I wonder if this record and tradition A caves may reflect the phase when all the monasteries of Kuja, including the art, architecture, as well as monastic members, were controlled and supervised by the chief monk of the region. The preferred narrative subject of the wall paintings also display a clear difference. Tradition A prefers the stories featuring wealthy people like kings and merchants, and these are mostly represented in an elegant manner. So cruel depictions such as bloody self-sacrifice are limited. Another remarkable feature is that the Buddha's parinirvana scene is hardly highlighted and play any important role in tradition A caves. So in these caves, an effort was rather given to illustrate the Buddha's lifetime stories and also install the Buddha statue in the way to summon his spiritual presence into the cave. So he's, so to say, living, not really like a dead person. All these features are sharply contrasted to tradition B caves, in which stories featuring a wider range of protagonists, including peasants and animals, are painted. Cruel and bloody depictions, often including one's bodily sacrifice, can also be found in the jatakas and sermon scenes. Another significant difference is the emphasis of the parinirvana episode, including the depiction of the post-parinirvana events such as the First Council. At this point, I would like to introduce more specific painting materials in tradition A. So tradition A has two major types of layout of decor. So the first type is a cave decorated with a center Buddha statue occupying the main chamber, which I regard as the Kujan version of the Gandakti, so namely the sacred space to encounter and worship the Buddha. Another type is a cave thoroughly decorated with the paintings of a large figured field with the illustration of one Abhidharma story for each cave. So today, I would focus on the second type. So this cave type has either a square or a rectangular plan with dome or vaulted ceiling. Its basic decor is characterized by a single large figured field, so it's so large, around like 3 meters by and 4 meters wide, typically occupying the rear wall of the main chamber, but also sometimes on another wall. So the figured field always depicts one Abhidharma story, which is illustrated by larger-than-life-size figures. And the whole field is lavishly framed by multiple ornamental bands, as if it is a tableau painting set in a beautiful frame and hanged on the wall. The most important feature of these caves is that there are 1 or 2 windows opened on the front wall of the main chamber at the side of each entrance, so allowing enough sunlight to penetrate the main chamber, creating a very bright interior. So both the large size of the painting and the presence of the windows secure the high visibility of the wall painting inside the main chamber, the point which I wanted to discuss with Professor Xiao, but unfortunately he is now teaching. So the narrative subject of this figure field can be further classified into 2 types. The first type is the Abadana stories about good and virtuous kings who act as ideal laymen by practicing good deeds, such as abandoning high social status and material wealth to obtain true satisfaction by following Buddhist teaching, or accepting Buddhism and supporting the monastic community at the state level. And another type is the Abadana stories about kings and merchants whose misdeeds derive from their excessive greed. So they learn about the inevitability of causal effect of both good and bad deeds in their life, as well as the importance of taming one's greed as taught by Buddhism. Curiously, only in these caves, the images of meditating monks are depicted outside the large narrative field, sharply contrasting the sensuous world illustrated in the main narrative scenes. So these narrative images of kings and merchants provide positive or negative role model for lay followers of Buddhism and give a pedagogic message emphasizing the importance of being free from preoccupation with worldly matters such as high social status and material wealth. These images, however, would not have been the subject of veneration. So remarkably, there are no images of the Buddha in these cave types, meaning that this type of cave lacks an obvious subject of veneration. So we then have to ask ourselves, what was the purpose of these cave temples? So considering both the cave design to create the high visibility inside the cave, as well as the iconographical content of these narrative paintings, I guess if these caves were intended to have been the spaces optimized for storytelling with painting, illustrating Buddhist teaching, oriented for laymen who visited the cave temples. The choice of these narrative subjects of the mirror painting seems intentional, as parallels can also be observed in Mogao caves in Dunfan. So the Abadana stories depicted in the early Mogao caves all feature stories about kings. The Liu Du Jijing, one of the earliest Buddhist narrative collections translated into Chinese, was also compiled by Sogdian monk Kan Senhui in the late 3rd century, with the obvious intention to teach Buddhist ethics to Chinese emperors, and thus the compiled stories focus on the ideal way of being rulers according to Buddhist ethics. So the presence of the caves thoroughly decorated with a large painting featuring an Abadana story about kings and merchants in tradition B, which is actually absent in tradition B. Not the topic, but the cave, which is only decorated by this kind of story, is absent in tradition B. So this kind of tradition A caves may indicate that tradition A monastic community put significant effort to appeal to the loyal and wealthy laymen and to effectively promote their support for monastic community to receive their patronage. At the last, let's look on the situation on the textual sources of the paintings. According to my iconographical analysis, The narrative paintings of tradition A are closely related to Sanskrit literature dated to Kushan period, such as Ashwagosha's Buddha Charita, Aryashura's Jatakamala, Kumaralata's Kalpana Manditika, or various Chinese texts translated before the 5th century, including the Samyukta Agama, Ekottarika Agama, Puyaojin, Sisonri, or the Sarvastivada Vinaya, and so on. 3 of which were translated by Kuchan monk Kumarajiva. Interestingly, the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya is only related to a few paintings of tradition A cave, while it seems to have been the major source for tradition B. So many narrative subjects and iconographical details identified to date correspond, even if not at all, to the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya. So many are related. So an interesting fact is that even the same narrative subject can be illustrated with a very different emphasis, likely based on different textual sources among tradition A and B. So this is Grünweder's drawing of the elaborate painting of Kijiu Cave 83, the narrative subject of which was identified as Udlayana Abadana by Bert Schmidt in 1920s. 3 moments of this beautiful story are illustrated in this painting. So first, Udlayana, so King Udlayana, foresees the death of his consort, Queen Chandraprabha, within the 7 days. He is in a depressive mood while looking the consort dancing. Then the queen wished to be ordained and spend the last 7 days of her life as a Buddhist nun, and the king allowed it. The queen indeed passed away after 7 days and then immediately reincarnated as a heavenly being and encouraged the king to do the same. The king also eventually accepted to be ordained by abandoning his social status and material wealth. Iconographical details of this painting match best to the Fosho Zazanjing, so which is translated by Faxian at the beginning of the 5th century, among many other sources narrating this story. This is the only version of the Udlayana Badana, which ends with the ordination of this royal couple. A close parallel is known in the Huanxi Go Wang Yuan in the Dunhuang transformation text. On the other hand, the same Udlayana Badana is depicted as one of the narrative subjects of the sermon scene in the second Indo-Iranian style paintings in tradition B, Central Pillar Caves. In these paintings, the main figure of the composition is not a king, but the preaching Buddha, and its iconographical details correspond to the Mula Sarvastivada Vinaya version of this story, describing the tragic fate of the Rolka kingdom, destroyed by a sand rain that was caused by the unvirtuous deeds by Prince Skandin. So at each corner of this scene, you can see the resident of Rolka buried under the sand rain. So the touching ordination of the royal couple, which was a main concern of the tradition A version of this painting, is not emphasized here at all. So when I gave a presentation to summarize these observations in Japanese in the last November in Tokyo, Dr. Yosei Tanaka, he is a specialist of Sarvastivada doctrine and especially Abhidharma literature, who is a lecturer of Bukkyo University. He was my commentator and he provided me extremely interesting suggestions. Now, his comment is going to be published in the Journal of Abhidharma Studies, Volume 4, in this year very soon. So here I summarize his argument. So according to his view, our tradition A may be related to the heretical group of the Sarvastivadin Sautrantikas, so meaning the follower of the sutras, which was active in Gandhara in the time of Kumarajiva. The Sautrantika put importance on the literature of Ashwagosha and Kumaralata, The latter was based in Tashkulugan at that time and just influential in the oasis town along the northern Silk Road. The texts of both authors are related to the paintings decorating the tradition A temples. On the other hand, tradition B seems to reflect the doctrine of the Orthodox Sarvastivadins of Kashmir. So when Xuanzang stayed in Kucha in the early 7th century, he had a dialogue with an eminent Kuchan monk, Mokshagupta, which reflects Mokshagupta's exclusionary attitude against any other text than the Orthodox Sarvastivadins, including those of the Sautrantikas and Mahayana. Considering the historical records on Mahayana teaching, historical records that Mahayana teaching were well accepted by Kuchan Buddhists, especially by royals until the 6th century, Kuchan Sarvastivadins seems to have gone through a radical shift from the Sautrantikas, which could also accept Mahayana teaching, to the more fundamentalist Orthodox Sarvastivadins of Kashmir between the time of Kumarajiva and Xuanzang. So this may be the explanation for the shift from tradition A to B, which we observed in the archaeological remains. Dr. Tanaka's suggestion to bring our tradition A in connection to Gandhara and tradition B to Kashmir actually makes sense if we consider the change of the main traffic route between China and India in the middle of the 6th century. In the 4th to the 5th century, the traffic between China and India was quite smooth, and the main route was passing through Kucha, Kashugar, and Gandhara. So this situation was altered by the political turbulence of Central Asia in the middle of the 6th century, which is related to the shift of political power from the Ektalite to the West Turks. Since the security of Gandhara area declined, the traditional Gandhara route was replaced by a new route connecting Tokharistan and China and Xinjiang, and then Tokharistan and Kapisi via Bamiyan. So thus, the direct connection between Kucha and Gandhara must have been suspended in this period. But this does not really explain how the cultural contact between Kucha and Kashmir was possible. But there is an old mountain pass which connected the southern Silk Road, like Khotan, to Ladakh. So you can still see some archaeological remains of this route at the India-Pakistan border of the area of Ladakh. So it could theoretically be possible to use this route for Kashmiri monks to reach to Kucha. So, furthermore, according to Ines Konchak-Nagel's recent important finding, the iconography of some Hindu deities in the second Indo-Iranian style paintings shares common features with Kashmirian sculpture, which are dated no earlier than the 6th century. This could also be indicative of the Kucha-Kashmir link, which might have existed after the 6th century onward. So here is my conclusive remarks. So the shift of the trend of the narrative decor from the tradition A cave groups and their first Indo-Iranian style painting to tradition B cave groups and their second Indo-Iranian style may signalize a shift from one Sarvastivadin group to another in Kucha, namely from the Sautrantikas from Gandhara to the Orthodox Sarvastivadins from Kashmir. So their different doctrinal attitudes might have been mirrored in the narrative paintings decorating their own monasteries. This shift may be related to the change of traffic situation of the Silk Road. Yeah, but there are many hypothetical elements included in my talk today, and maybe at some point I may oversimplify the complexity of Kucha caves. So my hypothesis definitely needs further elaboration and correction, so I would be very grateful with any critical remark from you. So thank you so much for the attention, and this is my request.
So I'm just going to give short introductions to our two final speakers of this morning's panel. So Diego Lucota Received his PhD in Buddhist Studies from UCLA's Asian Languages and Cultures Department in 2019 on a dissertation entitled The Goods That Cannot Be Stolen, Mercantile Faith in Kumaralata's Garland of Examples Adorned by Poetic Fancy. He's currently an assistant professor in the same department at UCLA. His area of specialization is the spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road during the first millennium of the Common Era. He's a philologist by training, but has keen interest in art, history, archaeology, and modern ethnography. Having worked on Kucha, his more recent research is on the Iranian, Sinitic, and Indic traditions of the oasis of Khotan, so we'll be talking to you for our later workshops. Among his most recent publications are Mahayana Sutras in Khotan, quotations in chapter 6 of the book of Zambasta, which was published in the Indo-Iranian Journal. Also, a new Kharoshthi document from Kucha in the Hötien County Museum collection, which was published in non-Han literature along the Silk Road in 2020. He's currently working on a book manuscript on the life and times of the 3rd century Gandharan Buddhist author Kumaralata and the crisis of the urban mercantile classes that supported Buddhism through most of its dynamic phase in South Asia. And then our second speaker is Fang Wan. She received her MA in art history from Tsinghua University in China and is a PhD student at the Institute for South and Central Asian Studies at Leipzig University. She's also a research associate of the Research Center, Buddhist Murals of Kucha on the Northern Silk Road at the Saxon Academy of Sciences and Humanities in Leipzig. Her forthcoming dissertation, I think it's this year. Am I correct? Okay. It's forthcoming. Under direction of Monica Zinn, is titled An Iconographic Research on the Mural Paintings of the Buddha's Life in Treppenhöhle. And once finished, is to be published as in the Leipzig Kucha Studies series. Her area of specialization is Buddhist art history, and her interests include visual narratives of the Buddha's life and religious and material culture along the Silk Road. Aside from her upcoming dissertation, she has published several articles in Chinese, German, and English, including one co-authored with Dieter Mauer and Jens Uwe Hartmann, Sakyavardhana in der Treppenhöhle von Kisel, which was published in a Festschrift for Georges Pinault. Another article that was published this year is the wall painting of Siddhartha descending on the elephant in Kisel Cave 110. So these are our two speakers, and I would like to invite Diego to join me at the podium. Please help me welcome him.
Good morning. So let me start from the point in which I want to end. This is a Tocharian manuscript. In this case, this is Tocharian A, not Tocharian B. So this is an exemplar of this vibrant literature in the Tocharian languages, A and B. It is a very, very rich literature. The problem is that it's broken. From each text, we have usually 3 or 4 pages. So it's not for the faint of heart when the story is getting to its best point, broken. And the longest manuscript we have is in Tocharian. In fact, the Maitreya Samiti Nataka, a theater play, but it's only about 70 folios. We don't have the full thing. It is a very rich, so let's not call it literature, maybe a tradition of literacy. Beyond theater plays and this nice Buddhist literature and poems and so on, we have all sorts of things. We have secular documents, receipts, deeds, personal letters, love poems, all sorts of things. So we have here the Tocharians writing their own language. and using their own language to express all the possible things that you can do with language. I will start, however, far away from Cucha, in my ancestral Guatemala, with a point of consideration that I would like you to take in mind. I have been very interested recently in the problem of indigeneity. Coming from Latin America, I contend with a very difficult, messy, long story of interaction between the people who lived in the American continent and waves of migration, forced migration, Spanish migration, all sorts of migrations. And this is one of my favorite books in the whole world. This is the sacred epic of the Quiche Maya people in Guatemala, who had their own hieroglyphic writing before the arrival of the Spanish. And at the very beginning of the book, we're told this book existed in our own indigenous script, which implicitly is now forbidden. And so we keep writing our language, but now it says under the voice of God and under Christianity, implicitly in the Roman script. So that is one reaction to say being invaded, being controlled by a different culture that is trying to assimilate you, right? So we adopt this new script, but we keep writing our own language, and this is the 16th century manuscript. Just as so now back to Cucha. And back to Monica's remark yesterday that what we have from these Buddhist monasteries and temples from Cucha looks like Little India. Maybe this could be better said here, just for us to have a refresher of the area. So Cucha is in orange up there, Cotan in green on the southern rim, and I will be also mentioning the Federate Kingdom of Shanshan. The capital is Lowland on the east, although I will be mentioning also some documents from Nia. So back here, this is the big masterpiece of Cotanese literature, the Book of Zambasta, this very beautiful, very elaborate miscellany on Buddhism. And this is a famous passage in which we're told in a complaining tone by the poet of the Book of Zambasta, whose name we don't know. We're told the Cotanese only seem to enjoy Buddhism if it's expressed in Indian, Hindu. We do not know what they mean here, if it's Gandhari or Sanskrit. This person, however, who uses male verbal form, so we can call him safely a he, this person, talks about other people, like the Chinese, for example, who enjoy listening to the Buddha's law in Chinese. And the Kashpera, who here they're often translated as Kashmirians, although this is a huge problem because we know nothing about Kashmir in this early age. This is a 5th century text. And you know what the Kashmirian language could have been is a complete mystery. I personally do not believe that this indicates the modern value of Kashmir, but if this interests anybody, we can talk about it later on during Q&A. So the author of this poem tells us, I'm going to write in Cotanese to show the Cotanese themselves that Sanskrit, or in any case, these Indian languages are not necessary to convey the law of the Buddha. We can do it in our own indigenous languages. So let me start with a bit of the chronology of writing in the Tarim Basin, which I'm going to refer to mostly through its Chinese denomination, the Western regions, because I'm going to be dealing a lot with Chinese materials. So let me premise now that after all this beauty of these frescoes, I'm going to bore you to death with documents. with documents which are sometimes very ugly, but I find them very exciting. So we just heard Satomi dating the first Indo-Iranian style to after the 500, more or less. I'm going to be talking today about centuries after that, which is by when we have documents and inscriptions and coins. By now, our estimation of the oldest Tocharian B and Kutanese manuscripts is late 4th century or early 5th century. So sometime around the 5th century, we see in the whole region these indigenous peoples starting to write down their own indigenous languages. The problem that is really, really puzzling is that for the last 5 centuries, there had been writing in the region. There had been a tradition of written history, of writing, however, not in the indigenous languages, in wet languages. Interestingly, the oldest written documents that we have of the whole region are in Chinese. And of all things, they are the strangest thing you can imagine. They are gift tags. They are gift tags more or less of the Xin dynasty, which lasted very, very shortly in the 1st century, or the Han dynasty. And they are gift tags attached to gifts exchanged by the royal aristocracy. Interestingly, the language is Chinese, but the names, the personal names involved are not Chinese. They are long names, which do not fit like the pattern of Chinese names. And very probably they reflect indigenous personal names. So these these gift tags that tell us also that the local nobility in the Western regions was also trying to adapt to Chinese forms of royal or courtly etiquette. And this matches very well Han Dynasty accounts of efforts to first, say, court these local aristocracies in the Western regions through diplomacy. One thing that will stay very stable is, for example, Chinese wooden stationery. On the right, we have Han Dynasty Chinese document, and on the right, we have a document in Gandhari from the 2nd or 3rd century from Nia. And as you can as you can tell from the image, they're very similar. They have this hole for a clay seal. First you would tie it with rope, and then you put a clay seal and mark it. So some of these Chinese conventions stayed very stable. So we have much later Khotanese documents from the 6th or 7th century that still use this format. The next thing I want to show you is, which I find very, very telling, even in a metaphorical sense, are coins. By now we have this very early 1st century coins from Kucha. And interestingly, they are bilingual, Gandhari and Chinese. The styles of the king, the full titles of the king, are written in Gandhari. In this case, the name of the king is Tuga, probably Tug in Gandhari. And this seems to match a royal name from the Chinese imperial chronicles, rendered with a Chinese character, which in its late Han phonetic reconstruction would be Duk. The feeling of the Chinese towards this ruler seems to be, at best, kind of not sympathetic, as the character itself means poison, so this is King Poison. So the title of the king is rendered in Gandhari around the figure of a horse, and then the other side has the weight and denomination of the coin in Chinese. And we have similar coins from Khotan, which have been known for a long time, and also from a polity called Sheti, which we have no idea where it would have been. They were found in Khotan, but it's called Sheti. And if anyone is familiar with these coins, the whole, say, landscape of coins in the Western regions has been recently redesigned by its first descriptor, which is Joe Cribb, formerly curator of coins at the British Museum. What I find most telling and most metaphorically kind of relevant about these coins is that they reflect exactly what we know by now about the political landscape of the region at this early time in the 1st century, which is contention between the Han Dynasty and the Kushans over control. If we think about this time period, the Roman Empire and the Kushans in India and the Han Dynasty in China, and this flourishing trade and this interest in controlling the trade routes, this contention, this struggle over the Western regions makes very good sense. And we have very good evidence to tell that during the 1st and 2nd centuries, the Kushans and the Hans were fighting over who took over. For reasons that we still don't understand fully, but that I have some ideas that I would like to share with you. From about the 2nd or 3rd century, what becomes very, very dominant in the region. And here we're talking Khotan, Kucha, Shanshan, is the paradigm of late Kushan Gandhara. Late Kushan Gandhara, not early Kushan Gandhara, which is Gandhari in the Kharoshthi script is used for administration, for secular documents, and so on, whereas literary texts are written in a different script, Brahmi and in Sanskrit. Keep these two scripts in mind. Kharoshthi is often described as ugly or sloppy. Let's say that it's cursive. It's meant for rapid annotation, to write down. It's a legal hand. It's fast, it's cursive. And the language is this vernacular, right? The language that presumably people spoke on an everyday basis. The contrast with Sanskrit written in the Brahmi script is very stark. Brahmi is this careful book hand. Sanskrit is, of course, the classical literary language of India, meant for works of literature, for sacred books. There's, of course, like a time in India in which we do seem to have like this strong vernacular movement in terms of Buddhist texts in particular, Jain texts as well. But by late Kushan times, there seems to be diglossia and digraphia. So we're using different languages and different scripts. And the scripts have, by the way, also varying different origins and trajectories. So this is a manuscript from Kucha. It's probably a 2nd century manuscript of Buddhist theater plays written in very good classical Sanskrit. This particular play is not the one that is attributed to Ashwagosha, but belongs to the same sort of milieu. This is later, but still maybe 5th or 6th century from Kucha, and it's a Sanskrit declension exercise. You can imagine here a Tocharian student of Sanskrit toiling through the declensional forms of a Sanskrit adjective, in this case, Shrimat, glorious. So this goes like, the glorious, of the glorious, for the one glorious, for the two glorious, and so on and so forth. Here we have some of the oldest Tocharian bean documents. This is a secular document, and it's written on one side. So what you have on top is the recto, and it's in Gandhari, and it's very bad Gandhari. It's barely understandable Gandhari. Gandhari ceased to be written in Gandhara proper by the end of the 3rd century, This is now dated to the either late 4th century or early 5th century. So it seems to have been preserved as a legal language only. My favorite analogy is with law French in England, which was used from the Norman conquest up until the 17th century. You know, like notary clerks had to write in French. But by the 17th century, it was like French that was so bad that, you know, it's barely comprehensible. It's like, well, I cannot imitate it, but it's basically so full of English terms that it's no longer considered French at all. Then the verso has instead very early Tocharian B, and it's written in Brahmi, in the script that was before then used for Sanskrit. So that's another point that I would like you to keep in mind. This is another of these documents. They have been studied by Qing Zhaorong, whose talk we're going to listen this afternoon. So let me move on now to what I will call here military chaplains, or although if we're talking military, what we're going to be, what we need to talk about is not only chaplains, but also soldiers. The Western regions were under formal Chinese control, and here I have to make a small caveat. What do you mean by Chinese? You know, like throughout the middle of the first millennium, there's no China, right? There's division. So just as a clarification, I mean by Chinese here, any polity that used the Chinese language as its official medium of communication, I'm calling Chinese. Even though very often they were, you know, ethnically, the royal house was not ethnically Chinese and so on. So just as a shorthand, and with the caveat that this is much more complex, I'm going to be calling Chinese any polity that used Chinese as its medium of communication. So the Western regions were under formal Chinese control only partly during the Han Dynasty, so sometime between the late 1st and early 2nd century, and then up until the Tang Dynasty in the 7th century onwards. But one thing that we see periodically is small assertions of power of this Eastern Chinese or Sinitic dynasties in the Western regions. And that is the settlement of small military garrisons. Think about them as an American military base in Germany or in Japan. They're not directly influencing like local politics, but they are there to show, look who's like ultimately in power, right? And they control certain things. We have some, for example, transit permits, telling us that some caravans along the Silk Road had to ask for permission from the Chinese military garrisons to pass through from this very era. And these were, in fact, military colonies, in the sense that soldiers were expected to work as farmers most of the time, and then when it was needed, they could go on combat. And here, this is a bit, I'm going to be changing a bit the order of my slides, but we have evidence that some of these people, after their military duty was over, these people settled in some of these places in the Western region. So from the documents of Nia, we do have evidence of proper Chinese settlers in Khotan, in Kucha from later on. So again, we have to contend with the presence of Chinese military colonies and Chinese settlers proper within the landscape of the Western regions during this, from very early on, from the Han Dynasty onward. This is the piece on which I want to concentrate, and so I will spend a bit of time talking about it. This is the colophon of a manuscript, and it's written in 3 hands, as you can see. Of course, classical Chinese is read from right to left. So let's go bit by bit. So this bold, beautiful scribal hand is by the monk Huangzong, and here I wasn't consistent in this, and I apologize for that. This is reconstructed Middle Chinese, not Mandarin, although I realize that I have been inconsistent. So the monk Huangzong wrote this book at the frontier. That's all he tells us. He wrote this book at the frontier. So the frontier is this key element that I want you to keep in mind. Then we have this much more exhaustive, and then we have the fascicle number, which is number 1. We're going to learn soon what text this is. Then we have this information about the exact year, which is the year 411, so early 5th century. And we're told that 3 monks, 3 different monks, checked the text, checked that the copy corresponded to the original. We're also told in the third hand that you can see the leftmost hand, we are told the person who ground the ink, who has a very Buddhist sounding name, has a surname, Zhang, but then the name means like born, to be born as a Buddha or something along those lines. And we're told that this is a copy of the Lotus Sutra. Lotus Sutra, which doesn't seem to be very influential in India itself up until very late, but which turned out to be hugely, hugely important in East Asia. One of the dying wishes of Seishi Karashima was finally finding a Gandharan manuscript of the Lotus Sutra, and it didn't happen, but I think it might be the case, since we have been finding a Gandhari manuscript of Mahayana Sutras recently. So what does the frontier mean? This is an album of the finds of the Otani expedition of Count Otani. It is this large compendium of photographs of objects, of manuscripts, and so on. And it evidently has errors. So it has led people to doubt the information contained in this album. But the album says that this manuscript was found in Kucha, and that the frontier is Kucha. Again, during Q&A, if this interests anybody, we can discuss the problems entailed in identifying the frontier as Kucha. At this point, we need to talk a bit about chronology. This is the period of the so-called 16 dynasties in China, and it's dizzying. Basically, we have people killing each other or waiting till the emperor dies to create a new dynasty and go on to, murder somebody else. So we start with Emperor. And let me premise here another point, which is that at this point we're going to have to contend with 2 very different types of sources. One is Buddhist historiography, which in this case is going to be concerned with the life of Kumarajiva, with the monk Kumarajiva, which I have in bullet point number 2. And the other is the official dynastic chronicles, which so it's really fun how they match in the chronology, but they tell very, very different stories. So the story that interests us starts with the 16 dynasties, the dynasties, in fact, is a euphemism because there are actually more. So, nobody remembers all the so-called dynasties that appear in China during this time period. Here we're talking about the former Qin dynasty and Emperor Fujian. sending General Lu Kuang to conquer the western regions, to conquer Kucha and Khotan and all these places we have been talking about. His biography was this military guy who didn't enjoy playing. Like his one favorite childhood game was organizing his playmates into like battalions and making them like fight with each other. So, you know, this sort of military genius. In the year 384, Lu Kuang lays siege to Kucha and conquers it. Just for a bit of anecdote, Lu Kuang, in his official dynastic biography, is said to have had 3 omens that predicted that he would be able to conquer Kucha. One was that his arm veins became swollen. So you can imagine him as the, you know, bodybuilder that the chronicles want us to imagine him like. And they became swollen in the shape of 2 Chinese characters, Jipa, which means something like colossal overlord, colossal macho guy. So that was one. Then a black dragon with fiery eyes started visiting the Chinese camp, or the former, former Qin camp. And thirdly, he had this dream of the Buddha as a golden image, flying out of the citadel of Kucha, flying over walls and moats, and landing in his camp, which he took as a sign that the Buddha had abandoned the Kuchians, the Tocharians, and was now supporting him. And so he took Kucha, and he was so impressed by what he saw there that he commissioned a whole poem describing the beauties of the citadel of the capital city of Kucha, which we unfortunately do no longer have. He takes with him the monk Kumarajiva, who was reputed to be this great savant. And now when I tell you the differences between the Buddhist biography and the say, dynastic chronicle, we're going to have more to say about Kumarajiva. So he takes Kumarajiva with him, this very learned monk. Lu Kuang apparently wanted to stay in Kucha and set it as his capital and make it and stay there. But Kumarajiva himself told him to go back to what is nowadays Kansu and take over that part. In 386, which is only 1 year after Lu Kuang, after the death of, there's a mistake here. After the death of Emperor Fujian of the former Qin, Lu Kuang declares himself king of a new dynasty, with his capital in Kutsang, nowadays Wuwei in Kansu. And then things go crazy again with the death of Lu Kuang as king, as Wang, in the year 400. A number of things happened there. So the governor for his new dynasty, the governor for the western regions, declares himself prince. We're going from emperor to king to prince. So the emperor, this governor, Li Gao, declares himself prince of the western regions, creates a new dynasty called the Western Liang, and stays there as prince. Then Kumarajiva, who had been with Lu Kuang, moves to the court of to a court that is really in like the Chinese heartland, under the later Qin dynasty in Chang'an, in what is nowadays Xi'an, under Yaoxing. Emperor Yaoxing. And that period, he arrives to Chang'an in 401. And the last years of his life are devoted to translating Buddhist sutras into Chinese, producing like hugely influential translations. And then finally, by the year 430, we have finally attestations of embassies of Kucha, of independent embassies of Kucha to, say, central Chinese dynasties. So Kucha was no longer under occupation. Let's go back to the colophon. This is the year 411, and there's a few things that are extremely surprising about this. Kumarajiva died either in the year 409 or the year 413. So 411 means that Kumarajiva was either still alive or just recently had died. So this shows that all of these dynasties that had split were still very much in touch, and that this text, like newly translated in central China, had reached Kucha in a matter of months, maybe. Let's go back now to the Buddhist biography. The most interesting part of the Buddhist biography is that it is intended to depict Lu Kuang as this horrible pagan heathen. So Fujian sends Lu Kuang to conquer the western regions just to get Kumarajiva. No? You know, like he's this famous super savant who knows all languages and who's learned in all the Buddhist scriptures. So go and get Kucha so that you can have Kumarajiva. Then at the court of Lu Kuang for 15 years, Lu Kuang just tortures Kumarajiva. And he's so determined to torture him that he imprisons him in this room, makes him drunk, and lets naked ladies in so that Kumarajiva has to break his vows of chastity. Right? And then in this Buddhist biography, Yao Xing pleads with Lu Kuang to give him Kumarajiva and pays this huge amount of money for Lu Kuang to release Kumarajiva. Although it's a bit suspicious that Kumarajiva ends up at the court of Yao Xing only after Lu Kuang dies. Let's talk briefly about, before the chaplains, or before we come back to the chaplains, the soldiers. One point that I find extremely telling is that this is more or less a 2nd century text from one of the Chinese military garrisons stationed in Shanshan in lowland. This is a classical Confucian text, the Zuochuan, which is a military chronicle, a series of biographies of great military men, meant to instill, heroic valor among soldiers. Interestingly, it's a paper roll which was reused to write a Gandhari letter. So this shows us the coexistence of these indigenous cultures which were using Indian languages by this point, and the Chinese military garrisons. This is another example of that. This is Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit, but written on Chinese paper with a brush, not with a reed. Here we can, let's go back to the colophon. What I find really most telling about this is that in the case of the occupation of Kucha by Lu Kuang, we seem to have Chinese Buddhist monks following the Chinese troops. And here, as you can tell, I like parallels. So during the Spanish conquest of what is nowadays most of Latin America, we know that again there were priests and monks coming directly with the troops. Part of what they did was evangelizing, right, and trying to acculturate or assimilate these indigenous populations. They also, we know that they acted as scribes, they fulfilled a variety of functions. But what I find most interesting is that if by the 2nd century these Chinese soldiers and Chinese military were reading this classical Chinese texts, by the late 4th century and early 5th century, they seem to have been reading Buddhist texts, which mirrors the great increase in popularity of Buddhism during this early medieval period. And again, the monastic biography of Kumarajiva intends to depict Lu Kuang as this heathen and violently anti-Buddhist person. But in the travel chronicle of the monk Song Yun, who was sent in the 6th century from the court of the Northern Wei to Gandhara, he talks about this place near Khotan, where he found a temple that did not look Western at all, or Hu in the Chinese original. And this, what does non-Western mean? It probably means Chinese. It means something he was familiar with. After asking the local elders, they told him that this had been a temple set up by Lu Kuang. I am running a bit short of time. I wanted to show you just briefly. There seems to have been experimentation with writing the indigenous languages, and in particular with Kharoshthi, which makes sense because it's the everyday, script for writing everyday things, even though if it wasn't in the indigenous languages, right? It was in Gandhari. The secular documents that we have are in this kind of chancellery Gandhari or legal Gandhari or court Gandhari, if you want. This is a very, very old document from Kucha, 3rd century, issued by King Pitribhakta, which is a name that doesn't sound very Buddhist, sounds in fact a bit Hindu. And the document is written in Gandhari. However, it has phrases that do not read like Gandhari at all. Read instead as little short phrases in what could be Tocharian B. Like I have shown this passage to a number of Tocharian B specialists. There's grammatical features that sound very much like Tocharian B. The tse ending is the genitive singular ending for thematic stems in Tocharian B. So this would be of the una, but we don't know what the una is. If we read this, Yoleve would be like bad quality sheep skins. If we read as Sholeve, this would be living sheep, and so on. So we have here experiments maybe at writing Tocharian B, the language of Kucha, with the Kharoshthi script within these documents in Gandhari. This is a similar example from Khotan, in which we have this Kharoshthi document peppered with words in Khotanese, and using, in fact, some diacritical marks, some special writing signs that are used only in Khotanese, in particular that last one expressing the diphthong I. And finally, we have languages that we have not deciphered. This is a language that we have. There's a number of people trying to decipher this, myself included. We have come up with the name Northern Tarim Basin Para Kharoshthi. It is Kharoshthi. As you can tell, it's kind of like careful Kharoshthi, which is interesting, but we do not know what language this is. And this is old. There's this recent discovery by Chen Ruixuan and Pantal of the fact that many early Tocharian books are written on recycled Chinese paper, which was folded and pasted and covered in stucco and then reused. So you have here the underlying Chinese text and the Tocharian written on top. So the Chinese text is literally hiding inside the Tocharian page. One point that I want to highlight here is that this is all paper. This is all paper, and although we're using reed here, I showed you earlier an example of Sanskrit text written with a brush, and we also have examples of Tocharian B written with a brush. So we ended where we started, and I want to, my final points here are that in sociology, the concept of reactive identity implies emphasizing indigenous elements when you are forced to assimilate, forced to give up a part of your ethnic identity. For what I can tell, Lu Kuang seems to have been interested in the promotion of Chinese Buddhism in particular, which may have been a bit too much for the Tocharians and for the Khotanese, for whom Buddhism may have been a core part of their identity, and in particular, an Indian form of Buddhism. What explains, for example, the shift from this parallel use of Chinese and Gandhari to only Gandhari and Sanskrit? Was it the military garrisons? Was it like this constant military pressure? After experimentation with Kharoshthi, we shift to Brahmi, which is a much more careful script, much more laborious. And it was the language of the Buddhist sacred texts. It is, in a way, an unnatural choice. Instead of this handy cursive script, you go for this like very careful book script. Was it because it was associated with the Buddhist scriptoria, because it was like the symbol of say, Buddhist literacy? Is an idea that I have. For, again, proper Chinese occupation during the Tang, we have very good evidence of a network of Chinese monasteries in Kucha, in Khotan, in Shanshan, as part, again, of the occupation apparatus. So, this leads me again to this notion of reactive identity. So what I'm not suggesting is directly that Lu Kuang's occupation of the Western regions and of Kucha in particular for the case of Tocharian B was what, say, led the Tocharians to write their own language using the script using in Buddhist monasteries, but rather that as we saw, there was a period of experimentation, and that what may have triggered this final, settling down on Brahmi was this particular event. It was like an event that catalyzed or that triggered an impulse that may have been boiling under the surface for a while. And with this, I end my talk. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It's my great honor to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation and the organization. So my topic today is about the mirror sequence of the Buddha's life in Taiping Huila. Of course we know that the Buddha's life belongs to the most fundamental subject matter of the Buddhist art, but it's painted here in this cave, Kizu Cave 110. And first we start with some basic information about this special cave and its mirror decor program. So the cave was first named as Taiping Huila by Gunwider over a century ago. The reason was quite simple because, as we can see, there's a stairs cave widening to the antechamber of the Kizu 110. And we can see till now, the modern photographs, this structure is still visible. So because of this staircase, this cave was named Taiping Huila, the staircase cave. And we can see from the historical photograph that the cave is located quite isolatedly from the neighboring caves. It belongs to the Gunei district, the inner part of the whole Kizu site. Yep, as we can see, even inside this district, our Kizu 110 is the innermost part, which means it perhaps be dug after the other more accessible locations had been used, had been occupied. So it might be possibly that this cave is later than the neighboring caves. And we can see the Kizel 110 is grouped with a rectangular cell, of which the function is not clear anymore. It perhaps functions as a monastic cell, or perhaps it's used for storage. But we can conceive of this group as an independent small monastery. It is quite enclosed, isolated, and it has an antechamber which is fully collapsed. But perhaps there is some area beneath, but has already been destroyed. So inside this group, Kizel 110 is the only one decorated with mirrors. So it is a worship hall of this small monastery. And inside we can see 3 rows of quadratic pictures of 60 in total in number, illustrates a full life of the Buddha's story. So we need to have some glance on the documentation materials. We had the early expeditions conducted 1 century ago by the German, French, and Russian, and they brought some pictures, made some removals of the pictures and took it to Europe, and they made the earliest photographs, which is housed nowadays as an archive of various museums in the world. And we had a lot of publications that reveals the photo materials of this cave. And I'm also grateful for the permission of Professor Dr. Wittenbeck, the previous curator of the Museum of Asian Art in Berlin, to let me use some unpublished modern photographs by him. And also Greenweder made a first drawings of the Mala Vijaya in this cave. And in the following discussion, I will rely much on the restorative drawings made by Monica. So we have an overview of the inside interior of this cave. As you can see, it had an entrance and small niches. And above, the Ines has just presented to us, there's a Bodhisattva in the Tushita heaven. And on the opposite lunette wall, there's a Mala Vijaya. And then we get to the mirror sequence of the Buddha's life. It starts from the left wall. As we can see, the monochrome historical photographs was taken both by the German expedition and also the French expeditions. So the scholars now has done some reconstruction research. And this is the back wall. We should notice that there are some natural variants besides the human detachment. So 7 of the pictures on the back wall cannot be restored anymore. But still we can combine the archive photos and the modern preservation in the museum to do the reconstruction work. And to the right wall, we can see it should be originally look like that. And the niches both the niches are empty. There's no statues preserved today, and we have no way to restore what it should be settled with. And the left niches shows over mandala with a pedestal, and there are traces of donors just on the next to the floor. And to the right initial, you see the design is not quite symmetrical. They have different patterns, but we can clearly see the soot. The wall surface is darkened by the smoke or perhaps by some remainings of burning lamp, burning incense inside the cave. But the particular ritual cannot be restored. And between the niche and the floor, there are patterns about the short pillars and some triangular textiles. And here perhaps we can see better. Yep. And also for the donors, unfortunately, most part of the donor representation had been destroyed, but we can see they wear the typical costumes in the local art, and the first 3 persons should be monastic persons, they should be monks. And this one is a layman, perhaps a laywoman, but we cannot tell for sure. But at least we can make it clear that the donor is a community mixed with both monastic and the lay persons. And here in the corner, there's a face. Perhaps it's not quite easy to discern, but there's the hair and the face is a male head. So you can see, I'm sorry, at this part. So yeah, and the donors, they are kneeling in an array that's quite humble, has a humble position because it's so minorly represented, and is humble in posture, which is quite rare throughout the second Indo-Iranian mirrors. It is quite near to the nearby first Indo-Iranian style. Then we can start from our mirror sequences of the 60 square pictures. And it should be noticed that above each pictures, there are designed blank stripes left for the Tokaram B inscriptions. And the decipherment is, of course, beyond my ability, but we have accumulated fruits made by other scholars. And I'm also grateful for the private correspondences in which Dr. Peo and Dr. Pan had provided me some very useful suggestions of the individual inscriptions. And then we can have a clear glance at how it is arranged. The 60 pictures are running in clockwise way in 3 rows from the picture number 1 to picture number 60. And here we have a full view of the restoration with the drawings made by Monica. So it starts from the descent from the Bodhisattva's descent from the Tushita heaven to the Maya's womb, and it ends with the parinirvana. So it's important to notice the different stages of the representation of our protagonist, our Gautama Buddha, because there are some imagery extracted from the mirror sequence. From the pictures number 1 to number 33 is depicted as a bodhisattva. It has only the head aureole behind the neck. He can be represented as a prince or later, after the great departure, he is represented as a bodhisattva. And correspondingly, the inscriptions above, they always start with the format. Here, the bodhisattva. So the appellations of this Siddhartha is quite clear. He is called bodhisattva. And from the picture 37 to 60, he is depicted as the Buddha with the full enlightenment, pictorially indicated. He has the head halo and also the body nimbus, we can call it a mandala. Even though there are severe scratches on the surface, but we can tell the contour of the both halo and the mandala is quite clear. And the inscriptions has made the corresponding change. The inscriptions are always started with here the teacher, the omniscient teacher, or here the Buddha does such and such things. So all 60 pictures are divided into small cycles, which indicate the different stage of the Buddha's life. And we can see it is arranged predominantly in a chronological order. It's quite linear enough. So it starts with the birth and the childhood, then get married, and made the renunciation, and goes to the ascetic practices, and got the final enlightenment, and made the career of preaching, and then the Buddha goes to the final extinction, the parinirvana. So we will go through some examples of the pictorial representations and to see some distinct features of the indigenous local culture, which is evidenced in this sequence of the Buddha's life. And we start with this picture number 1, entering the mother's womb. As we know, the Bodhisattva dwells in the Tushita heaven, then he took the decision to descend to our world into the womb of the mother to be Queen Maya. And here we have the restorative drawing. It's clear to see, I think. Here is Maya reclining in the middle, and she is guarded with the female guardians and accompanied by the sleeping musicians. And above, the Bodhisattva is riding the elephant to come down to the Maya's womb. So one can immediately see some familiar motifs imported from Gandhara, because the bedchamber is arranged in a symmetrical layout, and there are some Yavani female guardians which are quite characteristic of the Gandhara relief panels. And we see these sleeping girls. Perhaps it's seldom depicted in the conception episode in Gandhara panels, but it's frequently incorporated in another episode, the Bodhisattva's great renunciation, and it's also quite familiar to see it in Southeast India, like Amaravati school or something like other things. Important to us is reclining Maya and the architectural settings. Actually, they are not so much Gandhara. We can see the bold display of the beautiful body of Maya and the diminutive serial windows, which can find the ancient prototypes in central India. And this panel from Sanchiku stupa dates back from the 1st century BCE. We can see some similar windows and the similar sleeping posture of Maya. And even earlier from the most ancient example of conception episode that we have. This is a medallion from the Barhut stupa dating back to the 2nd century BCE, and we can see Maya reclining similarly with the hand, the right hand rest supporting the head. Although this depiction, as we can tell, is much archaic because Maya has her eyes open and is shown in a flat perspective, but we can tell from her feet and the action of her hand rest that he is probably also lying on her right body side. It should be noted that this lying posture can be comprehended as a long lying, which indicates a state of practitioner, doing something as practicing some religious religious practices like that. It should be interpreted that although here we have the lamp, it's definitely in the night, but Maya is perhaps not sleeping. She is doing something spiritually joyful, religious practice to await for the Bodhisattva to descend to her body. As we can see here, Maya has her eyes half open. It's almost as classical, it's much more flexible, cozier than the Barhut archaic and stiff posture. But actually the logic is almost the same. Maya supports her head with her former right arm and lying on the right side of her body, because this is a reclining posture of the practitioner reclining. And we know that in Gandhara, most times Maya is deposed as reclining on the left body, which can suggest a posture of sensual, though even the sexual art, because sexual way, because some literature would mention that Maya, after the intercourse of sex, then has welcomed the body, is a baby. But actually our picture 1 in Kizil 110 has the echo with the ancient Indian tradition to emphasize that Maya has a spiritual practitioner state in this moment. And important to us is this: although we have so many different Indian prototypes, archetypes, but this part, the Bodhisattva who is descending on the elephant, is never seen in Indian art. As we can see, it's quite. There's a small baby, a small youth, human force, and there must be a youth who riding on the galloping white elephant. Yeah, as we just saw in the Indian, from the most ancient Barhut medallion to the southeast India, from central India, Sanchi, to the northwest frontier, Gandhara, there's no such examples to represent the Bodhisattva as a human form. Even on some portable miniatures which circulates along the Silk Road, Some objects can be found in inner China, but they were made and they were provided in northwest India or Kashmir. This object can be dated even to the 5th century, to the Gupta time, contemporary to the Gupta times. But still, we have the only elephant who is embodied as a bodhisattva, and here the deities makes perhaps some praise with astonishment to witness the miraculous moment. So it's quite distinct that the Indian art is very loyal to the orthodox, that the bodhisattva should come down to his mother to be in the form of an elephant. But it's different as the China art. There's two Buddhist steles from the central plains of China. This one with inscribed date is 461, and this one is 10 years later from Shanxi province. So is dated with inscription to be 471. But we can see here, on the earlier Buddhist stele, this episode of the Bodhisattva's conception is represented without Bodhisattva. The focus was laid on Maya, who sleeping in the bed chamber and tended by her perhaps some palatial attendants. And 10 years later, we have the earliest representation of the Bodhisattva as a human form, riding on the elephant to Maya. Here, Maya is almost hidden in the architectural form. The focus of the iconography has shifted from Maya to the Bodhisattva. If someone is familiar with Chinese Buddhist art, one can immediately tell that later in Yungang or in Dunhuang, the conception episode is fully represented by a bodhisattva riding on the elephant. There's almost no necessity to represent Maya anymore. So it's clear that the Kucha paintings have borrowed the cultural influences, perhaps some new model, pictorial models from inner China. But how did it happen? We may ask, how can the local Tocharian people in Kucha understand Bodhisattva in their own conception, in their own local Buddhist traditions? We don't have any direct written evidence that come from Kucha, but we have some other relevant evidences from the professors, such like the Khotanese and some Chinese works that has relevances and origins in the Tarim Basin. It should be noticed that the Zambasta, the locator, has just introduced. It's quite loyal to the Indian Orthodox, so it describes the descent of the Bodhisattva as an elephant coming down to approach Maya. And in Kucha murals, we have numbers of Jataka stories which feature the Bodhisattva as an elephant. So, as I can understand, it's not much difficult for the Tocharian people in Kucha to conceive of the Bodhisattva as an elephant, because they are quite near to the Indian literature, and they have some pre-birth stories like Jataka that highlight the symbolism or significance of the elephant shape. But on the other hand, we have the work made by Kumagajiva and some meditation sutras, which is thought to be generated in Tufan. They also take it for granted that the Bodhisattva comes down as a rider on the elephant. So, because the distinct Chinese representation to visualize the Bodhisattva on the elephant, as scholars have argument, may result from the refusal of the Chinese to think the Bodhisattva, the great being, as only an animal. But it seems it's not a great trouble for the Tocharian people of Kucha. But still, as we can see around the Tarim Basin, the Chinese notion, as we can say, is such a new notion to conceive of the Bodhisattva as a rider on the elephant has its continuing impacts. We can see from the older Uyghur manuscript, which comprise a book with the title Matris Meat. It's definitely an indigenous work of the local oasis, Buddhist culture, and it's a biography of the Buddha Maitreya, but it's written as an imitation of Buddha Shakyamuni. So there are many parallels of the life legends. So in the episode of the dream interpretation, we had that account that there are different kind of dreams, but they make an hierarchical differences that those women who dream of an elephant, they can have a son that would surely become a Chakravartin. But superior to that, the women who dream of a youth mounts an elephant can have a son that become a Buddha Chakravartin. So it seems until that date in the 11th century, the Buddhist people who live in the Tufan oasis, they have been surely confirmed that the most auspicious or most supreme form for the Bodhisattva in the conception moment is a human form. He is a youth who is riding on the elephant. Then speaking of the dream, we come across some hybrid versions in the literature, because according to the Indian embryology, the theory of having a baby by the women, the Indians, they believe there's a really existing soul before the next birth. So there's something happens in reality. It's not just a dream. But so that the most biographical work written in the Indian language, in Pali or in Sanskrit, they can simply describe the conception of the Bodhisattva that an elephant has come down to the Queen Maya. But we have a group of 3 texts that they with special attention to describe this event with a parallel of an accident of the Bodhisattva's descent with a dream or Maya. It's perhaps too long to read, but the story is quite clear that the Bodhisattva has descended to Maya on the elephant, but Maya only sees the wing of an elephant in her dream. In the traditional literature, these two episodes are separate. We have an episode of the conception, we have another episode of the dream interpretation. But this text makes it compact to compare it. There are two different things. On the one hand, the Bodhisattva has come down as a youth or as a splendorous human being riding on the elephant, but on the other hand, Maya only sees a white elephant in her dream. It's also important to note that this text, Taisho 193, which is sophisticatedly written in Chinese, is perhaps made by first hand by the Chinese Buddhist scholars, but they have some parallel fragments in Tocharian B languages. So there must have been some cultural exchanges, have been some import of the thoughts of the artistic models from the inner China to Kucha, which have been underestimated before. Then we come to another episode in the birth cycle is the birth, the nativity of the Bodhisattva. Perhaps with joy it's better to see. So we can see Maya is standing under the tree and she is giving birth to the Bodhisattva in Lumbini Park, but actually the picture has been not completely preserved, and there are some concrete miracles. The horse and the elephant, they have their cubs, their children at the same time, and here we can see a shell. There is some miracles such like the trees gets itself exposed from the ground for such like that. Actually, this part we have parallels in artistic representations from Ajanta 16 or some Indian prototypes. But it's interesting to consider perhaps the elephant, the horse, and the treasure, they may have some association with Chakravartin, because of course Prince Siddhartha is qualified to be a Chakravartin, the king of the universe, when he does not take the religious path to be a Buddha. And remotely in the art of the Tang Dynasty, almost approximately 7th century, we have some depiction of the Chakravartin with the 7 jewels together with the birth scenes. But it should be reminded that the shell, the Shankaratana, as a symbol of wealth, is only found in the Indian art. So our Kucha pictures have some remote archetypes from Indian art, and also it has perhaps further influences or some interchanges with the Chinese art. But important of this picture is that we should notice there are some parallels even inside the second Indo-Iranian art paintings in Kizil. We can see from the better preserved depictions that the Bodhisattva comes out from the mother's body underneath the armpit. Here is quite clear to see. We know that from the earliest Indian art, the Buddha was at first not represented as a human form. It's indicated by the footprints or some icons. So we don't have the very earliest representations of the newborn bodhisattva from the mother's side, a mother's body side, from the Kanagalohali or Sanchi. But here with the Matula panels, perhaps there's some anthropomorphic representations of the newborn bodhisattvas, but we can see the junction of the newborn with the mother is at the hip. And also in Gandhara, it's overall in Indian art, and even on some portable miniatures circulating along the Silk Road, they still had these conventions. So even in China, we can see these two Buddhist steelers, they also take the ancient convention from the hip. But from the 7th of the 5th century on, we have the new pictorial innovation that the Bodhisattva comes from the armpit. So perhaps Monica can give a better explanation of it, but so far as I can know, there's no textual accounts regarding this detail. It might perhaps result from the artistic innovation. They think there's a space, then they put the bodhisattva under the armpit. But it's just like the conception episode, there are two distinct artistic schools. In India, it's always come from the hip, and also until some early Tibetan artists like that. But in China, they want to represent it from this era, right under the armpit. Then we go to another special representation in the worship of the yakshas. It is much damaged, but as the story tells it, the newborn bodhisattva was brought to the family temple of the Shakyavadana, the tutelary god of the royal family, or perhaps to the Shakya clans. And the intention is to make the presentation of this newborn to the tutelary deities to get protections from the spirits or yakshas. But these two yakshas, they have in turn worshipped the newborn bodhisattva to display their respect. As the inscription hence here, the Shakyavadana, the name is clear. Yeah, it corresponds to many literature descriptions, especially in the Mula Sarvastivadi Vinaya, the yaksha at the place in the city or perhaps outside the city of Kapilavastu of the Shakya clan is called Shakyavadana. It literally means the growth, the raising of the Shakyas. But all the literature with the Shakyavadana's name, they only tells of one single yaksha. But here in the picture we see clearly two yakshas. So perhaps the local adaptations, the local understanding of the Kucha people, and Professor Moa has suggested perhaps has some relations, or perhaps with some relevances with oral legends of some apopaic texts, such as the Mahamayuri or some protective texts. They tell of in Kapilavastu there are two giant, strong yakshas dwell there to protect the people. Although the two yakshas, they are not given the name as Shakyavadana. So we can see from the birth cycles, the mirror sequence of the local innovation of this cave, they display some cultural influences directly from the ancient Indian art from the inner China, and they also formulated some their own legends that cannot be simply evidenced by the written accounts. And then we will go briefly to several other examples. The wedding cycle, as we can see when the Bodhisattva grows up, and he has enjoyed his youth life in the palace, and the father who got the prediction that the prince might someday go for the religious life, and is urgent to give or take a bride for the prince. And the prince goes through a series of contacts to win the hand of the bride. So we have the depiction of the decision to take a bride, but it's interesting to note that there are some conflictive accounts across different literature, because here we have the episode that the Bodhisattva starts here, the prince. He is giving out presents to the girls who are coming here for the choice of the Bodhisattva's bride. Here is a female figure. And the Mula Sarvastivadi tradition tells that the Bodhisattva has distributed different golden ornaments to the girls, and only Yashodhara refused to take it. And then the Bodhisattva gets noticed that Yashodhara, a beautiful lady, and the two, they have immediately the affections with each other, and the wedding continues. But according to Mula Sarvastivadi Vinaya or some relevant literature of the same school, this episode happens after the context of the Buddha's, of the Bodhisattva's technicals or something. It's almost, it's not the case of our mirror sequence, because here we have the picture number 12, and then we have a series of contexts. So the Bodhisattva must go through a series of competitions against his fellows, his rivals, and when he finally won, he can win the hand of the bride. So that narrative order is exclusively found in Lalita Vistaka and in the so-called Apinisakamana Sutra, Taisho 190, and Mahavastu, other than the Mula Sarvastivadi Vinaya. And here we can see this event takes place outdoor in the park. It's a detail exclusively corresponds to the Buddha Charita and the Taisho 193 with such mixed details altogether. And the inscriptions have mentioned that he, as we can see, is Shivayavaga is a choice by the bride herself takes place. Actually, this word appears twice. One time here, about this picture, and another time about the wedding scenes. So the Shivayam one is corresponding to the surreal competitions because the bride must choose the best groom for herself. So the Bodhisattva should go through a lot of matches to demonstrate his own skills, his superiority over the others. But it is important to notice that this mirror sequence has represented a mutual choice between these two. At first, the Bodhisattva has distributed ornaments or presents to all the valuable girls in Kapilavastu, and then the girl here with the name, the bride is with the name was given in another inscription, but we know that her name is Gopa or Gopi. But the Gopi has also selected by herself her own groom. So they both made their own choices. That's not included in any Kanai or scriptural Buddha's biography. It's only envisioned here in the sequential narrative order of our wall paintings. And we can see they both hold something like a string in the hands. Actually, this is a wedding thread in the ancient Indian culture, and also it's interesting to notice that the Shivayam Vaga, the choice of the groom or the choice by the bride to decide which groom she would select is a very popular motif of the drama performance. In Indian culture, there are some Sanskrit literature that mentions about it, such like Bhagata Muni, the author of the theory of the dance, the very important theoretical book. He is said to direct an act of the Shivayavaga in front of the gods and deities, and also of some local manuscripts. We have such shades of evidence in Tocharian languages, as like that, and also this text itself is a drama text, and has mentioned that the queen, actually the queen has done Shivayavagam when she was a princess, or such like that. So we have some theoretical figures that had been let down in the article by Monica or by Satomi. We know there are representations of Vidushaka, or some evidences of the visualization of the theoretical elements in our paintings. And here we can find some more connections with, perhaps, as we can say, there's no such exact corresponding literature about such representations, but we can find it with a lovely culture behind it. Perhaps the Tarim Bacon, they have borrowed some practices of theatrical performance, and they are familiar with such legends, and they will formulate such iconography. And also yesterday, Monica talked about some falling arrows. Actually, I can only find remote references from the Uyghur minority along the Silk Road in Hexi corridor. They are Uyghurs, actually in Chinese it's Uyghur. that Marathi was almost the last stronghold of Buddhist communities along the Silk Road in the surrounding peripheries of the Islam. Yeah, just next near Xinjiang, but it's in Gansu province. Until the 18th century, the Russian scholars have succeeded to find the Suvapasa, Jingguangmingjing, or some Mahayana Sutra manuscripts from the community. So scholars they consider that minority are direct descendants of the old Uyghurs who were active in Tufan or the so-called Tokharians in Xinjiang. And the Uyghurs, they had such wedding practice, the wedding celebrations. They will shoot arrows to the sky to celebrate the coming of the bride. And after shooting the arrows, they will collect the wooden sticks and break it to have a fire. It is with a giant blank space and time between it. And we will go through some further examples, but it's very quickly. We can see here in the great departure cycle, when the Bodhisattva has endured the 4 encounters, had met the first meditation, had met with another girl and got the praise, and he is now aware of his decision to leave home, to pursue a religious life, and he should beg for the permission from the father, King Shuddhodana. It seems nothing special because the picture layout is very similar. We have only 4 figures, and here the prince is constantly accompanied by the horse groom, Chandaka, and the royal couple. They are always depicted as a pair in this cave, very conventionalized. But it's important to note that there's a tree and an umbrella. They are indicators of outdoor settings. Usually in this cave, in all these individual square pictures, we only have one single setting for one scene, either interior or outdoor. But here, the depiction of such outdoor scenario, it seems to me is corresponding to the account in Lalita Vistaka, both in Sanskrit and also in Chinese translations. It is about a miracle performed by the prince. When the prince has made up his mind, his body shines bright in the night. So the tree and the outdoor settings got brightened, got illuminated. So it seemed to me it's such a weird device to remind the viewers, either the Tokharian viewers in the past or our modern viewers, of some small incidents. And then we come to the leaven from Kapilavastu. It's also a crucial episode in the Buddha's life. And the picture is not complicated for someone who is already familiar with that episode. Here is the city of Kapilavastu, and the Bodhisattva heads on his horse, departing from the Kapilavastu, and he is attended by his horse groom, and the horse was supported by flying yakshas to unmute the noise. It's not to disturb the others, because the father, of course, he was not willing to let the son leave. But it's important to us is here is a human god with a halo, actually. She is presenting something. She is gifting something to the prince. As we know, with a great departure, Apinis Karmana, the Bodhisattva is so much determined. He does not need anything valuable anymore. He is going to be an ascetic. So there's no need to arrange some gift for him. But this unique representation in this cave. And we have some parallels. This is from Kizil 99. Here we can see the city fortress, the Bodhisattva on the horse, and a goddess who is holding something. Because in picture 25, we see this object has been destroyed. It's not to restore. But with the parallels, we can see perhaps it's some like a vase with flowers. It's Purnagata, the ancient Indian auspicious symbol, which means inexhaustible water. Actually, it should stand for the Dharma, the milk of Dharma, the incense of Dharma, the holy water, because we have some indirect accounts from the old Uyghur texts. It's, as we just said, it's life of Maitreya, but actually it's compiled as an imitation after the life of Buddha Shakyamuni. So they must have some same structures, and in the episode of the Great Departure, it's narrated that the city goddess of Kapilavastu has presented a bowl of milk to the Bodhisattva and then said, it's exiliar of the Dharma, it's an incense of Dharma. Take it and make it for the profit, to spread it for the profit of the all sentient beings, for all the life. So, and also in Subasi, perhaps we can find some contextual depictions, because in Subasi, as we know, it is a series of meditation cells. But there are depictions of surreal encounters of the monk, perhaps in the spiritual meditation visualizations, the monk will encounter with many different persons. And here on the entrance, we can see a goddess with a halo holding a vase. Perhaps to me, it's a local understanding of the local concealed imagery of the symbol Dharma, essence, water, milk, like that. And then similar symbolism perhaps may be connected to the partaking of the milk, because we know there's the Tokaran B manuscript that narrates the episode at length. It describes different miracles of cooking the milk dish for the Bodhisattva. The ascetic Bodhisattva partook the milk dish and then went to the Bodhi tree. But it's interesting to us is here. The Bodhisattva has deposed the bowl to a river. It's an episode written in the Pali Nidadakata and some separate in Chinese compilations of the Buddha's biography, because we know the two girls who dedicate the milk dish to the Bodhisattva belongs to the northern Buddhist literature, but here we find something with the southern literature, and it's a prediction because the bowl goes against the torrents. It goes upwards and hit to the previous bowls of the past Buddhas, and it's a prediction of the Buddha's coming enlightenment. And here we have the Brahma who takes the bowl from the river. it's also not attested in the literature because the literature only tells the Indra or Naga takes the bowl away. And the literature, they mention there were 3 past Buddhas who threw the bowl into the river, but here we have 7. So there's some local legends. So yeah, we can comprehend this mirror sequence as an independent biography of the Buddha used there by the people. They have their own traditions, so there are many conflictive elements. But it's also quite hard to interpret this picture because the action is clear. It's a preparation of the body seat. The bodhisattva is going to sit there and got the final enlightenment. But why these 2 figures? Because we have some parallel depictions, artistic depictions, or textual descriptions that Indra helped the bodhisattva to prepare for the seat. But here we can see this person, I would say he is of the double presence of Siddhartha. The Siddhartha is represented once as a prince, but without much jewelry, but the special hairdo or the special garment is exclusive to him. And then the ascetic. And we will go through some special, unique traditions that occurs here. The Bodhisattva, the Buddha, after enlightenment, he gets some gift from the tree goddess. But actually, we know it's also a compound narrative. If we want to search some evidence from the literature, because almost the narrative order of the Enlightenment cycle corresponds to the mainstream biographical work, scripture of the Buddha's life, but there are some distributed traditions that describes the tree goddess rather than Indra or someone else to bring the Buddha the medicine fruit. And so we have seen through the fluent narrative order, which is quite linear. It's almost neatly nailed through a chronological order, but we will encounter some sudden interruptions. There's the incorporation of the Jataka stories. There's the Jataka stories of the Dipankara and Sumati, and the prediction of the monk Priyadasha. And then it's also not so much linear, not so much chronological, the carrying of the sick monk and something, till when we approach to the end of the mirror sequence. So as far as I see all these stories, they will highlight different identities of the protagonists. Some are young Brahma, some princess, noble women or female, the monk, and the monk. Perhaps they will correspond to the need of the donors, because the donors is a community, a mixed community of monastic persons, of the laymen, lay women, so they would try to incorporate such perhaps not so regular episodes into the Buddha's life. And it's also important to notice such episodes, of course, it's not so mainstream Buddha's life, because it's mostly recorded in different Vinayas of various schools, different schools, and it's even regulated that the monastic a decoration should include a scene of the Buddha carrying the sick monk. So, as I could say, perhaps such preferences by the donor themselves would influence the arrangement of the motif of the subject matters. And also there's the Indra god who is watering. We have other parallel depictions in Kucha paintings, so we can restore the manly plot. So such as a watering ritual is also emphasized in the Central Asian meditation texts and like that. And then we go to end. The Parinirvana cycle is not so much long compared to the full sequence, but it's also important to notice that Monica's book has fully argued the tradition is rather oral, vernacular. Perhaps first crafted in Gandhara in the oral form, verbal form, rather than written down in the manuscripts or written down in the real scriptures. And even among the very popular subjects of the three stories of the Parinirvana cycle, we have encountered something irregular. Here's Kashyapa and Ananda who changed their positions compared to the very mature and conventionalized representations in the local Kuchan art. And then we come to a conclusion quite swift and dating. As I can see, the cave is dated to the early 7th century because the philological linguistic they had tell from the script, the way of handwriting, that the inscription is roughly at the beginning of the 7th century. And also as to the pictorial content, as we can see, this cave departs from the Indian prototypes a little more from the same school. In the second Indo-Iranian pictures, mirrors, we see in Kizil 99 still has such a bull-armed figure, which is quite near to the Gandhara art. But in our Kizil 110, this person has already been gone. It's not represented anymore. And here we can see in this picture, compared to the very mature and profuse detailed pictures, the river, the crucial pictorial hint is erased from our Kizil 110 picture. So it is such an aberration from the ancient Gandhara prototypes, has its own irregularities. It should be a later sign. Even among all the second Indo-Iranian mirrors, this cave cannot be the earliest stage. It may be more generalized or developed inside the same style. And we have almost the local innovations. And here we can see from the picture number 1, picture number 60, we can see there are some irregular or new adaptations, even among the second Indo-Iranian style. And here we can see as the very middle central disposition of the whole sequence. This is a leaving from Kapilavastu. This is a preparation of the body seat and the temptation of Magas. They will display some sonority. So as I can see, this cave is carefully arranged, and it's not all accidental. It's carefully designed to be irregular. And such parallel of the departure and the Magga or the Enlightenment as a pair, as we can see, have from the very early prototypes in Indian art, but based on the Indian tradition, the KL110 has its own innovations. And to the school affiliations, we have two things which are exclusively found in Mula-Sawa stewarding tradition, but that's all. Yeah, we still can find some features that can only go to other traditions, like Mahavastu, all the Abhidharma texts, the Vinaya texts, so much distributed. And some local legends cannot be restored from the written sources. So that's my conclusion, this local Buddhist art. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.